Hello, and welcome to Gotta Catch and Keep Them All. This is a session recorded for the OAGC 2020 Fall Conference. My name is Becky Renegar, and I'm so glad you've decided to join me today. I'm a gifted coordinator and specialist for Milton Union Schools in West Milton, Ohio. This is my 17th year working with gifted students. I've taught students in grades K through 8, and this is my 4th year coordinating. If you have any questions about my session, if you're not available for the live question and answer, you can reach me through my email, renegar@muschools.com. So let's get started. As we begin our session today, I'd like to talk about the process that we go through for identifying students and some of the problems that we run into as a result. One of the issues that we have often is kids falling through the cracks. Sometimes we just completely miss them in our identification processes. Other times we'll identify them, but then later on down the road, they don't appear to be gifted or they don't perform at the levels that we would like to see them performing at. So as we go into our session, I've got some guiding questions. First, how do we identify students as gifted? What social emotional needs do these kids have, and how can we support those needs? What academic needs do those students have, and how can we support them? Who are we missing? How can we find them? And what are some common issues that are faced in middle and high school? And how can we navigate those? Sometimes when working with teachers of gifted kids, I end up inevitably being asked the question, how did that kid get identified as gifted? Usually this is a situation where there's a student that's underachieving or is causing behavior problems in class, not meeting the expectations of the teacher in one shape or form. And sometimes I think part of that question stems from a perception of what a gifted child is. So pause for a moment and think for yourself, how do you envision a gifted child? When someone says, describe a gifted child, what are the things that come to your mind? Now, think for a moment about who your colleagues might see when they envision a gifted child. What are some of the thoughts that they would have and expectations that they would have of someone who is identified gifted? And now think about community members, people who aren't in education. How would they describe a gifted child? There have been times when I've talked to others outside of education about my job and what I do, and I mentioned that I work with gifted children. And several times I've gotten a reaction that, oh, those are some really special kids. You must, really have a big heart to work with that population of kids, which I agree, but I think they're mistaking gifted kids for the other end of the spectrum. Or sometimes I'll get, wow, you've got all this really smart and good kids. Your job must be so much fun and so fantastic. And then sometimes I get met with, well, those are just all of the kids whose parents are pushing for programming. I had a discussion on one of my Facebook groups. Somebody brought up some issues that the gifted students were coming in for in-person learning a day more than the typical students were. And they were there was a lot of comments about how that was not necessarily an equitable thing and how ridiculous it was that the gifted kids got to come in, but the general education kids didn't get to come in that extra day. And it was really interesting, the back and forth and the reasoning behind it. And of course, I couldn't keep my mouth shut. But, one of the things that I tried to point out is depending on the model of service, it could be that those students are coming in to work with the specialist for their identification. So definitely, there's a lot of perceptions about gifted, a lot of political concerns. Thinking about how society views gifted children. Think about how they're portrayed in movies and in television shows. Everybody loves Sheldon Cooper. Everybody's annoyed by Sheldon Cooper. But those students that work hard and they achieve and they're successful, those are the kids that are kind of portrayed through the movies. Think about, in terms of through the news, how gifted students are portrayed. With all of the mess that went down in New York in the spring, when they wanted to get rid of gifted programming because of inequities, yet they weren't willing to address the inequity in the process that they were using for identifying kids. In a way, they were taking away from the very students that were needing the services, who were coming from those underserved populations, rather than looking at the process by which they identified students. Thinking about an experience I had back at Christmas time, I was driving to a store and I looked over and there was a bus for the Clark County MRDD. And across the side of the bus, there was a big sign that said, "All children are gifted. They just unwrap their gifts at different times." And I was pretty upset by this sign because, I felt as though it really marginalized a group of special needs students from the very people that are advocating for and supporting the needs of special needs students. It would have been like me saying, well, all children have special needs, so therefore we can marginalize the populations that really do need those extra supports. Just give them some more time and it'll be okay. It was kind of upsetting to me to see that. So we have some different attitudes in society. And part of that stems from some of the processes that we use for identifying and serving gifted kids. I've been in districts where gifted services are a status symbol. And parents want to use that status among their peers. If you ever have a chance to read some books for enjoyment, I read a book over the summer. It was called The Gifted School. And it was about a group of families in Colorado who wanted their children to be identified to go to this gifted magnet school and all of the drama surrounding that. But when we take out the dramatic, when we take out the concerns that we have for status, and we really look at the kids, and we really look at what they need, we need to realize that these students come from all walks of life, from great homes, from not so great homes, in poverty, in wealth. These students are coming from across all cultures, and we need to do a better job at recognizing and identifying those students so that we don't continue to perpetuate that idea that gifted kids are the rich, smart, white kids who are well-behaved and have good homes. Perpetuating that myth only perpetuates issues like what we saw with the New York gifted school programs. If you're a fan of The Simpsons, you might remember the episode where Bart gets accepted into the gifted school by scoring well on a test. So take a look at this clip and look for some of the stereotypes about giftedness and the school and how education for gifted students looks compared to that of the regular classroom situation.
Aw, come on, Mom.
You look very intelligent, dear.
No way.
How about a tie, son? Everybody knows boy geniuses wear ties.
You're stifling my creativity, Dad.
Sorry, boy.
Bart, this is a big day for you. Why don't you eat something a little more nutritious?
Nonsense, Marge. Frosty Crusty Flakes are what got him where he is today. It could be one of these chemicals here that makes him so smart. Lisa, Maybe you should try some of this.
Homer?
I'm just saying, why not have two geniuses in the family? Sort of a spare in case Bart's brain blows up.
I don't care what that stupid test says, Bart. You're a dimwit.
Maybe so, but from now on, this dimwit is on easy street. No rush, Dad. Take the scenic route.
Gotcha.
Oh, no. Ties.
Don't worry, son. You can have mine. Here, let me show you how to put on a tie. The hook goes over the top, and these things go in there.
Thanks, Dad. You kissed me.
Well, there's nothing wrong with a father kissing his son, I think. Now go on, boy, and pay attention, because if you do one day, you may achieve something that we Simpsons have dreamed about for generations. You may outsmart someone.
You must be Bart Simpson. I'm Ms. Milan, your learning coordinator. Let me say right at the start that we have one rule here. Make your own rules. If you feel sleepy, take a nap. If you get bored, feel free to take out a book and start reading.
What should I read, ma'am?
Why, anything you want, Bart.
Oh.
A comic book? How did this get mixed in here? We used it last week as a prop in a film we made about illiteracy. Bart, these are the students who will share your work area. This is Ethan Foley.
Oh, Mem Sahib, Bart. Rabbi has memo. What?
Ethan's very good with palindromes. You know, sentences spelled the same backwards and forwards. And this is Sydney Swift.
Trabbing Norm Duke. What's your problem?
Oh, don't mind Sydney. He's just speaking in backwards phonetics today. He said, "Good morning, Bart." And this is Cecile Shapiro.
Hi, Bart.
Cool hamsters. What are their names?
Hamster number 1 has been infected with the staphylococci virus. Hamster number 2 is the control hamster.
Hi, little control hamster.
I wouldn't get too attached, Bart. We're dissecting him next week. Discover your desks, people. Now let's all welcome the newest member of our collective experience, Bart Simpson.
Got one journal.
And now we can continue our debate from yesterday. When we left off, Calvin and Tanya were arguing that free will is an illusion.
If you ask me, humankind has freedom, but a freedom fraught with paradoxes. Freud shows how childhood shapes our subconscious mind, but this helps us to think for ourselves.
Very good, Ian. Does anyone else have an example of a paradox?
Without law and order, man has no freedom.
If you want peace, you must prepare for war.
Well, it seems the smartest child in the class is also the quietest. Bart, what other paradoxes affect our lives?
Well, you're damned if you do, and you're damned if you don't.
Well, I guess that would be a paradox, too. Thank you, Bart.
Phew.
Tell you what, Bart, I'll trade you the weight of a bowling ball on the 8th moon of Jupiter for my lunch for the weight of a feather on the 2nd moon of Neptune from your lunch.
Well, okay.
There you go.
I'll trade you 1,000 picoliters of my milk for 4 gills of yours.
Well, all right.
Anything you say.
Bart, would you wager your cupcake against my...
Save your breath.
When we think about the expectations that are generated through media, through news, in terms of what a gifted student is and what education for those students should look like, we develop these perceptions that are a direct result of some of that bias from the shows that we watch. In this slide, I have what I like to call a sparkly gifted child. This little girl could very well be gifted, but she sparkles. She stands out to teachers. Think about some of the comments that might be made about her. She comes from a great family. Look, she gets all A's. She works really hard. She's always prepared and she's an excellent student. She's a really nice kid, goes above and beyond, so mature, a pleasure to have in class. Now, that doesn't mean that this student is not gifted. She could be a high-achieving, gifted child. This is the student that would be referred by teachers because of how well they play the school game. Now, let's think about, though, what happens when our perception of a gifted child is only this. Sorry, I had to put this in for all you Hamilton fans out there. But seriously, who did we miss? When our perception is that a gifted child is sparkly, or that they come from a great home and they always get all A's and they're wonderful teacher-pleasing students, we end up missing the gifted kids that are in their own little worlds half the time, or that they're constantly interrupting class, the ones that are disorganized and never turn their work in on time, those who aren't coming from great homes and their parents aren't involved. Maybe they're a little squirrely, they've got some needs to move, and maybe they struggle to read. Maybe there's some other things going on. They're failing other classes except for science. Oh, how could this kid possibly be gifted? They're failing. So we need to keep in mind that our perceptions need to be based in fact rather than subjective ideas. This kid can't possibly be gifted, some might say of the student described in the last slide. But we need to think about giftedness from a subjective perspective compared to an objective perspective. As we label students as being identified as gifted, we have an objective standard for which we are using as determined by the state of Ohio in terms of who is identified gifted and who is not. Remember, please, that Ohio's policy is once a child is identified gifted, they're always identified gifted. And I think this is probably the sticking point for a lot of middle and high school teachers, because they may have a child that was identified in early elementary school, and by the time they get to them, they all of a sudden look just like everybody else, or they're struggling. But that's not to say that they aren't gifted. So in Ohio, we use nationally normed assessments to determine giftedness. There are different states that use different processes. There are some that use other measures and checklists and things, but there is actually a list of approved assessments for Ohio, and it's in our resources that you can access through the site. But we have to look beyond the grade level norms. So, for example, the Ohio State tests, you could have a student get a perfect score on the 5th grade math test, but that will not identify them as gifted. Remember, those state tests only look at grade level content, and they're looking at how well the students have mastered a certain set of standards. They're not being compared to other students across the country at their age or grade level. Also, in Ohio, we identify students in subject areas, cognitive ability, creative thinking ability, and visual and performing arts. Not every state across the country identifies in the same way or in the same areas. When I was talking with Linda Silverman at the World Gifted Conference a few years back, we were having a conversation, and I was describing that I had a student identified as gifted in reading, and she looked at me like I had a second head, because they only recognize giftedness as that cognitive ability giftedness. So keep in mind that not only do different states have different criteria for identifying giftedness, but they also have different mandates in terms of whether they have to identify them at all, or whether or not they're served and how. So if you're interested in our resources, I've also got a link to NAGC's map where they have outlined what different states have in terms of their legal requirements for gifted students. Remember, for Ohio, at the time of the assessment, if we're talking about an academic area, at the time of the assessment, that child performed at or above the 95th percentile compared to same grade level peers. Or if we're looking at cognitive abilities, we're looking at 2 standard deviations plus or minus the standard error of measure above the mean on a test of cognitive abilities. Now, generally speaking, your cognitive abilities aren't going to change all that greatly. However, if you have a little child that is in 2nd grade and is hyped up on sugar and has very little interest in taking your assessment, you may not catch the abilities of that child, and if you tested them later, they may see you may see a totally different score. But generally speaking, if you get a good measure of those cognitive abilities, they're not going to fluctuate a great deal over time. But the academic areas of identification, those are the ones where teachers see kind of a drop-off, is what it appears to be. They think, well, they might have been gifted in second grade, but they certainly aren't gifted now. Or what's really happening here is not that we had a misidentified child, but think about how those assessments measure their ability, their achievement rather, in a particular subject area. So if you take a child and you give them a reading Iowa or Terra Nova or whatever test your district chooses from that list of approved assessments, in second grade, they're really strong readers. They are well above their peers. They score at the 95th percentile. They receive the identification of gifted in reading. However, the next year, maybe they kind of slack off. Maybe the teacher says, oh, they know how to read. Great. I don't have to worry about them. I can focus on the rest of my class that's struggling. Or I'm going to give them a little bit of enrichment along the way. And say that happens multiple years in a row. Suddenly, if you were to assess that child again and you compare their performance to that of other students at their grade level, they may or may not still be ahead of their peers in reading. Not to say that this depends solely on what the classroom teachers do or do not do with these students, but it definitely has an impact in terms of the students' ability to access the content that they need to stay at their ranking compared to other children at that particular grade level. So it's not that the child was gifted and now they're not gifted, or that they should have never been identified gifted in the first place, which is one of the things that I've gotten from teachers of middle high school grades, that, well, they're not gifted, so we should never have identified them as such. But we really need to think critically as educators about, are we really working to get the growth out of these students that they need by virtue of where they started? For those of you that are familiar with Stephanie Tolan, she has some wonderful analogies about giftedness and some of the different aspects of giftedness. One of the ones that I'd like to share with you today focuses on the dangers of focusing on achievement in terms of giftedness. So this is It a Cheetah by Stephanie Tolan. It's a tough time to raise, teach, or be a highly gifted child. As the term gifted and the unusual intellectual capacity to which that term refers become more and more politically incorrect, the educational establishment changes terminology and focus. Giftedness, a global, integrative mental capacity, may be dismissed, replaced by fragmented talents which seemed less threatening and theoretically easier for schools to deal with. Instead of an internal developmental reality that affects every aspect of a child's life, intellectual talent is more and more perceived as synonymous with and limited to academic achievement. The child who does well in school, gets good grades, wins awards, and performs beyond the norms for his or her age is considered talented. The child who does not, no matter what his innate intellectual capabilities or developmental level, is less and less likely to be identified, less and less likely to be served. A cheetah metaphor can help us see the problem with achievement-oriented thinking. The cheetah is the fastest animal on earth. When we think of cheetahs, we are likely to think first of their speed. It's flashy, it's impressive, it's unique, and it makes identification incredibly easy. Since cheetahs are the only animals that can run 70 miles per hour, if you clock an animal running 70 miles per hour, it's a cheetah. But cheetahs are not always running. In fact, they're able to maintain a top speed for only a limited time, after which they need a considerable period of rest. It's not difficult to identify a cheetah when it isn't running, provided we know their other characteristics. It is gold with black spots, like a leopard, but it also has unique black tear marks beneath its eyes. Its head is small, its body lean, its legs unusually long, all bodily characteristics critical to a runner. And the cheetah is the only member of the cat family that has non-retractable claws. Other cats retract their claws to keep them sharp, like carving knives kept in a sheath. The cheetah's claws are designed not for cutting, but for traction. This is an animal biologically designed to run. Its chief food is the antelope, itself a prodigious runner. The antelope is not large or heavy, so the cheetah does not need strength and bulk to overpower it, only speed. On the open plains of its natural habitat, the cheetah is capable of catching an antelope simply by running it down. While body design in nature is utilitarian, it also creates a powerful internal drive. The cheetah needs to run. Despite design and need, however, certain conditions are necessary if it is to attain its famous 70-mile-per-hour top speed. It must be fully grown. It must be healthy, fit, and rested. It must have plenty of room to run. Besides that, it is best motivated to run all out when it is hungry and there are antelope to chase. If a cheetah is confined to a 10 by 12-foot cage, though it may pace or fling itself against the bars in restless frustration, it won't run 70 miles per hour. Is it still a cheetah? If a cheetah has only 20-mile-per-hour rabbits to chase for food, it won't run 70 miles per hour while hunting. If it did, it would flash past its prey and go hungry. Though it might well run down on its own for exercise, recreation, fulfillment of its internal drive, when given only rabbits to eat, the hunting cheetah will only run as fast enough to catch a rabbit. Is it still a cheetah? If a cheetah is fed zoo chow, it may not run at all. Is it still a cheetah? If a cheetah is sick or if its legs have been broken, it won't even walk. Is it still a cheetah? And finally, if the cheetah is only 6 weeks old, it can't yet run 70 miles per hour. Is it then only a potential cheetah? A school system that defines giftedness or talent as behavior, achievement, and performance is as compromised in its ability to recognize its highly gifted students and to give them what they need as a zoo would be to recognize and provide for its cheetahs if it only looked for speed. When a cheetah does run 70 miles per hour, it isn't a particularly achieving cheetah. Though it is doing what no other cat can do, it is behaving normally for a cheetah. To lions, tigers, leopards, to any of the other big cats, the cheetah's biological attributes would seem to be deformities. Far from the best cat, the cheetah would seem to be barely a cat at all. It is not heavy enough to bring down a wildebeest. Its non-retractable claws cannot be kept sharp enough to tear the wildebeest's thick hide. Given the cheetah's tendency to activity, cats who spend most of their time sleeping in the sun might well label the cheetah as hyperactive. Like cheetahs, highly gifted children can be easy to identify. If a child teaches herself Greek at age 5, reads at the 8th grade level at age 6 or 7, or does algebra in 2nd grade, we can safely assume that child is a highly gifted child. Though the world may see these activities as achievements, she is not an achieving child so much as a child who is operating normally according to her own biological design, her innate mental capacity. Such a child has clearly been given room to run and something to run for. She is healthy and fit and has not had her capacities crippled. It does take great knowledge about the characteristics of highly gifted children to recognize this child. It doesn't take great knowledge about the characteristics of highly gifted children to recognize this child. However, schools are to extraordinarily intelligent children what zoos are to cheetahs. Many schools provide a 10 by 12-foot cage, giving the unusual mind no room to get up to speed. Many highly gifted children sit in the classroom the way big cats sit in their cages, dull-eyed and silent. Some, unable to resist the urge from inside, even though they can't exercise it, pace the bars, snarl, and lash out at their keepers, or throw themselves against the bars until they do themselves damage. Even open and enlightened schools are likely to create an environment that, like the cheetah enclosures in enlightened zoos, allow some moderate running, but no room for the growing cheetah to develop the necessary muscles and stamina to become a 70-mile-per-hour runner. Children in cages or enclosures, no matter how bright, are unlikely to appear highly gifted. Kept from exercising their minds for too long, these children may never be able to reach the level of mental functioning they were designed for. A zoo, however much room it provides for its cheetahs, does not feed them antelope, challenging them either to run full out or go hungry. Schools similarly provide too little challenge for the development of extraordinary minds. Even a gifted program may provide only the intellectual equivalent of 20-mile-per-hour rabbits, while sometimes labeling children suspected of extreme intelligence underachievers for not putting up top speed to catch those rabbits. Without special programming, schools provide the academic equivalent of zoo chow, food that requires no effort whatsoever. Some children refuse to take in such an uninteresting dead nourishment at all. To develop not just the physical ability, but also the strategy to catch antelope in the wild, a cheetah must have antelopes to chase, room to chase them, and a cheetah role model to show them how to do it. Without instruction and practice, they are unlikely to be able to learn essential survival skills. A recent nature documentary about cheetahs in lion country showed a curious fact of life in the wild. Lions kill cheetah cubs. They don't eat them, they just kill them. In fact, they appear to work rather hard to find them in order to kill them, though cheetahs can't possibly threaten the continued survival of lions. Is this maliciousness? Recreation? No one knows. We only know that lions do it. Cheetah mothers must hide their dens and go to great efforts to protect their cubs, coming and going from the den under deep cover or only in the dead of night or when lions are far away. Highly gifted children and their families often feel like cheetahs in lion country. In some schools, brilliant children are asked to do what they were never designed to do, like cheetahs asked to tear open a wildebeest hide with their claws. After all, the lions can do it. While the attributes that are a natural aspect of unusual mental capacity, intensity, passion, high energy, independence, moral reasoning, curiosity, humor, unusual interests, and insistence on truth and accuracy, are considered problems that need fixing. Brilliant children may feel surrounded by lions who make fun or shun them for their differences, who may even break their legs or drug them to keep them moving more slowly, in time with the lion's pace. Is it any wonder they would try to escape? Would put on a lion suit to keep from being noticed? Would fight back? This metaphor, like any metaphor, eventually breaks down. Highly gifted children don't have body markings and non-retractable claws by which to be identified when not performing. Furthermore, the cheetah's ability to run 70 miles per hour is a single trait readily measured. Highly gifted children are very different from each other, so there is no single ability to look for even when they are performing. Besides that, a child's greatest gifts could be outside the academic world's definition of achievement, so go unrecognized altogether. While this truth can save some children from being wantonly killed by marauding lions, it also keeps them from being recognized for what they are. Children with deep and powerful innate differences, as all-encompassing as the differences between cheetahs and other big cats. That they may not be instantly recognizable does not mean that there is no means of identifying them. It means that more time and effort are required to do it. Educators can learn the attributes of unusual intelligence and observe closely enough to see those attributes in individual children. They can recognize not only that highly gifted children can do many things other children cannot, but there are tasks other children can do that the highly gifted cannot. Every organism has an internal drive to fulfill its biological design. The same is true for unusually bright children. From time to time, the bars need to be removed, the enclosures broadened. Zoo chow, easy and cheap as it is, must give way at least some of the time to lively, challenging mental prey. More than this, schools need to believe that it is important to make the effort that these children not only have the needs of all other children to be protected and properly cared for, but they have as much right as others to have their needs met. Biodiversity is a fundamental principle of life on our planet. It allows life to adapt and to change. In our culture, highly gifted children, like cheetahs, are endangered. Like cheetahs, they are here for a reason. They fulfill a particular niche in the design of life. Zoos, whatever their limitations, may be critical to the continued survival of cheetahs. Many are doing their best to offer their captives what they will need eventually to survive in the wild. Schools can do the same for their highly gifted children. Unless we make a commitment to saving these children, we will continue to lose them and whatever unique benefit their existence might provide for the human species, of which they are an essential part. Teachers might then ask, so why am I not seeing what I would expect to see? When you think about gifted students and their expectations, one, you want to check your expectations, but two, there are times when gifted students do not perform up to what we would expect that they should be able to do. This idea is known as underachievement, and according to the National Association for Gifted Children, it's the expected unanticipated difference between accomplishment and ability. So it's kind of a complex situation. It's not always a simple, straightforward thing, and there's oftentimes many interwoven causes. But some of the causes that you would want to explore are there some social issues going on, such as peer pressure? This happens a lot with kids when they hit about middle school age. Boys, it's slightly younger. Girls, it's a little bit later into middle school. But the idea that it's not cool to be smart. When I was in middle school, about 5th grade, one of the boys in my class had said to his mom, "It's okay for Becky to be smart. She's a girl." Just that idea that we put out to students that it's not cool to be smart. If you look at, like, for those of you that used to watch Family Matters, Steve Urkel, there's another smart character that's seen as a great big nerd. So when in middle school, the importance of peer acceptance and friends is paramount, sometimes it's an opportunity that students see that they need to mask their abilities in order to fit in. Psychological issues such as emotional sensitivities or perfectionism. A lot of times I see anxiety in a lot of my students at the middle school that I work with. There's also the possibility for undiagnosed learning disabilities. There's a great book by James Webb and Edward Amond that's called The Dual Diagnosis and Misdiagnosis of Gifted Children. And in that book, they talk about how the symptoms of giftedness often overlap with the symptoms of other issues, such as ADD, ADHD, autism, but how students could have one of those and the characteristics overlap. So it's hard to see the giftedness and it's hard to see the disability. And sometimes both things are happening concurrently. There's also sometimes a lack of interest in the curriculum, or that curriculum is not challenging and engaging. And then in terms of expectations of teachers, they may have low expectations, especially with those twice exceptional students or with students from minority backgrounds or low income backgrounds, which that twice exceptional minority, students from low income backgrounds, those are the populations that are very difficult to sometimes identify and are often underserved. The situation in New York, that's where they were seeing gifted programs as being inequitable because of the underrepresented groups in those populations. There are definitely some things that we should be keeping in mind. As much as we'd like to say that we're perfect in finding gifted children, we often miss students, especially those that don't fit our perception of a gifted child. When districts rely heavily on referrals for gifted education testing, you're going to find that a lot of students are missed in that process because of that perception. This is why whole grade screening and talent development are imperative. The state of Ohio has required that we offer whole grade screening twice at the elementary in math, reading, superior cognitive abilities, and creative thinking. These whole grade opportunities give kids an opportunity at least twice in their career to be evaluated for giftedness. This also helps us to pick up on some of those kids that aren't quite so sparkly when teachers are making those referrals. We need to make sure that we're using the instruments that are designed for the population that we're assessing. If you look at the testing manuals for the tests that your district gives, you'll see that there are guidelines in terms of what population the test was used to be normed on. So in some populations, you want to make sure that whatever population you have is one that is measured by that test. Another thing that you need to take into consideration are the subscores. So for example, with the COGAT, you have a verbal, a nonverbal, and a quantitative battery. Whenever I give the COGAT, I want to make sure that I'm looking at all three of those subscores. The reason being is sometimes a student can have a large difference between one or two of those subscores that can often indicate that there's something else going on with that child. If they manage to not get an identifying score overall, but they have a high subset of scores, particularly nonverbal, I will often follow up with a different type of test that measures whatever that strength is in. So for example, if I have a student on a COGAT whose nonverbal score might be a 132, but their verbal score might be 110, I would take a look at that child and give them a different test, such as Raven's matrices or an NNAT, to measure that nonverbal ability and can potentially identify them as gifted based off of that test and that score. I would also be talking with his teachers and doing a little bit more digging to find out if there's something going on with that child that may impact that verbal subscore. Also, keep in mind, when a child identifies in the 95th percentile or above in an academic area, that is at that point in time. If they don't maintain that ranking relative to their peers, they can easily appear to be a typical learner. However, they're still identified as gifted. We have to consider the importance of appropriate challenge and growth opportunities to help prevent this slide. We may not be perfect at identifying gifted students. We try, but we will miss some. But whether or not we can identify them, the needs are still there for those students. Desi and Ryan identified 3 different types of needs for psychological health and well-being: autonomy, competence, and relatedness. So these kind of align also with Maslow's hierarchy of needs in terms of the physiological, the love and belonging, the ability to become self-actualized. So as we look at that, the 3 areas I want to focus on are autonomy, where students have the ability to have some control over their learning environment. For gifted children, this is especially important when you think about their characteristics. Oftentimes they've got some areas of strong interest and passion, and giving them an opportunity to explore those areas will help keep them more engaged in school. Competence. Gifted students need to be able to learn something new each day. This is a fundamental right that students have. All kids have the right to learn something new. And so for a gifted child, this can be a little bit more challenging in a typical classroom unless the teacher is aware and is doing specific things to differentiate for that child's needs. This could include and be not limited to acceleration, compacting, and giving children more opportunities to learn things at a greater depth and complexity. Relatedness. That's the opportunity to connect with others on an intellectual level, regardless of their chronological age. For gifted children, when they're talking about things that other kids their age have no interest in, or when their vocabulary is above the level of the children that they're playing with, sometimes they have some difficulty feeling that relatedness or like they belong. They may gravitate more towards the adults in the room than the kids. We need to make sure that we're providing opportunities for these kids to feel connected and related to others. And for at least part of the day, they need to have opportunities to interact with other children who might share the same interests or the same struggles or their same joys, regardless of how old these children may or may not be. So when we think about this, what other implications might this have for teachers and for schools? Take a moment to think about that. Even though we might identify students and differentiate for them in the classrooms and provide them with opportunities, it can still be a bumpy road. You have issues like perfectionism, anxiety, lack of home support, the issues with peer relationships, underdeveloped executive functioning skills. They may have some difficulty with organization, with getting started and maintaining task commitment. Those are things that all need support. You may have dual exceptionalities, disengagement, and as a result, some missing skills along the way. So as these students are progressing from elementary through high school, some of these issues are going to come up along the way. Oftentimes, you see a lot of it starting up in late elementary, beginning into middle school, and then by the time they get to middle school and high school, they may be missing some skills because these little bumps have kind of interfered with their learning process. So as a middle school, high school teacher, some of the things that you need to take into consideration is how are you assessing to find out what skills students are missing? And when you identify what skills these children are missing, how are you providing them instruction in such a way that they can have an adequate amount of practice, but not enough practice that they're bogged down in something that they already know how to do? And how can you finesse the curriculum to meet them where they are and pull them to greater levels of stretch? So what can we do? As educators, we need to think about some different strategies, not only to identify gifted children, but to help them be able to show us their abilities. Also, we need to think about how we can get through some of these bumps to help the children be successful and to continue being engaged and learning in school. So some things we need to consider, starting early with talent development. There's a great program. It's the Primary Education Thinking Skills Program. A few years back, what we did in our district is we went around and taught the PETS program in all of the first grade classrooms. This was a fantastic idea because not only did it provide us an opportunity to get our eyes on students, it was a fantastic professional development activity for all of the first grade teachers as they learned what to look for in gifted students. And it helped students learn to think in different ways so that when it came time to show us what they could do, they had the tools in their toolbox to do so. We want to make sure that we're using multiple tools and opportunities to screen and assess children. We don't want to rely so heavily on referrals from teachers that we're missing students who don't fit their perception of what a gifted child is. We want to make sure that the tools that we're using align with the population that we're assessing, and we want to make sure that for specific instances we're using the best test that can get the best picture of a child's abilities. We want to make sure that we're using instructional practices that teach and reinforce thinking skills. Some ideas to consider are Project Zero. You can look that up. It's through Harvard. De Bono's Thinking Hats, maybe Kaplan's Depth and Complexity. There's a lot of different programs out there, but using those thinking routines, teaching students how to make their thinking visible and how to develop their metacognitive abilities to think about how they're thinking and the way that they need to be thinking for the tasks that they're being asked to do. We want to make sure that we're utilizing acceleration, both subject and whole grade, and we're compacting and telescoping when appropriate. This helps students not be bogged down in the repetition of things that they've already learned how to do. We want to make sure that we're engaging students in meaningful learning, providing choice and connection. We want to make sure that we're using pre-testing to evaluate what students need and what students have already mastered. We want to make sure that we're developing relationships with students and with their families. The more we know about students and their families, the more easily we can develop those partnerships to help support them outside of school and keep them engaged. We want to make sure that we're supporting students in managing expectations. Sometimes students put a lot of pressure on themselves that they may be getting from outside sources, or they may be feeling that they have to always get everything right because they are gifted. And that's one of the pieces that's really important, is that students have that support, that they have an opportunity to talk with an adult about what does it mean to be gifted, and what does that mean for me in terms of my expectations and the expectations of others. When we shuffle that under the rug, I believe that students oftentimes will jump to their own conclusions about what that means. And having those open conversations with students will help them be better at managing their own expectations and being able to set goals and meet those goals. We need to make sure that we also have opportunities for some executive functioning support. Having an adult who can help support those, such as a guidance counselor, a gifted intervention specialist, a mentor, working with parents. We want to make sure that students have the tools that they need to be successful. I hate to see children who are missing out on learning opportunities for the reason that they aren't organized to handle it. So as a coordinator, one of the things that I do, especially when we're looking at accelerating students or placing them in an advanced class, is having those conversations with the teachers that just because they have the capacity to do something, they are going to have some obstacles that we need to work with the child through to help them be able to be successful in the advanced class. We want to make sure that we provide opportunities for students to develop relationships with intellectual peers. We don't want to sprinkle them out throughout a grade level so that they really feel like they're alone in a classroom. That's one of the best benefits, I believe, that comes from cluster grouping, is giving these kids some other students within their classroom that they can spend some time with. They can have those conversations. And for teachers, it's easier to differentiate for a small group of children than it is for one individual child. We also need to make sure that we are differentiating for challenge and that we're filling in any holes. We're looking at process, product, pace, and instruction. We want to make sure that as we are utilizing that pretesting to identify holes, that we are not limiting the child from going farther by virtue of them not knowing something from earlier on. We want to make sure that we address those needs quickly, efficiently, and thoroughly so that they can move on and they can enjoy and engage the process of learning. We know that it's never too late to help a child. We know that engagement in school trends downward as students progress from kindergarten through 12th grade. So we need to think about, as educators, what we can do to help keep those gifted students tuned in. We need to make sure that we are offering a continuum of gifted services throughout our districts, not just at the elementary. Consider using cluster grouping and differentiation with the classroom teachers. With ongoing high quality professional development. This can be a great service for students, perhaps with those academic IDs that maybe are struggling a little bit or are in need of just a little bit more. We need to think about the elective classes. You could have an elective class taught by a GIS At my middle school, one of the things that I do is I teach a class called Explorations, and I pull together students as an elective credit, students who are identified both superior cognitive and creative thinking abilities. So my class size is limited to a general pull-out size class, and we meet every day. But some of the things that we do is explore different subjects and interests that students may not have an opportunity to explore during the regular curriculum. We prepare for and take the PSAT, and I also do a book study with those children about giftedness, different strategies and success secrets, and we have the conversations about the experience of being gifted and to help provide some support for that. It also gives these students an opportunity to be around other students who are their intellectual peers, and it is a multi-grade class. You could also have co-taught courses with a GIS. I also co-teach with a science teacher. Every day we have a physical science section. It's a high school physical science class that we are teaching to students in 7th and 8th grade. You could also do advanced and honor sections, compacted courses. There's also the College Credit Plus and dual enrollment options for students that have the academic skills plus those executive functioning skills. Those can also be a great option. They may not always be the best option for students who struggle with task completion and the good student behaviors. So you need to think about, do you have different options for different students at their various levels of readiness? You also can consider acceleration. In the case where a student is still, even with differentiation, is probably going to be beyond what the class is, getting those students in the place where they have the opportunity to learn is paramount. And considering the process that you can go through for acceleration, there's a lot of tools that can help you determine how good of a candidate someone might be for acceleration. The key is to make sure that you support that child through the move and thereafter. That's one of the things that I am sure of when I do an acceleration at my school, is that case management, and that is critical to making sure students can be successful going forward from that point. Some other things that you might consider, though you can't count them as official services, but they're still beneficial to kids, is mentors, clubs and after-school programs. Those can be interest-based, things like Destination Imagination, Science Olympiad, Chess Club, those kinds of activities that appeal to student interests, that give them an opportunity to be around other students who have similar interests, access to mentors who can help students work through some of the teenage angst and help support them in making good choices. And thinking about also support services with like the school guidance counselors. That's one thing that I'm wanting to incorporate more at the middle and high school, is that relationship between the guidance counselors and the gifted students, so that when I'm not available, particularly at the high school, that there's someone that they know that they can have as their person in their corner that they can talk to and get support. Also, the guidance counselors are critical to making sure that students are making good choices in terms of the class placements that they have in order to get to the goals that they want to have going forward beyond high school. Remember that none of this is possible without a collaborative teamwork with others. Remember that you need to bring in your administrators, teachers, guidance counselors, community resources, and it's also not possible unless we advocate for recognizing and meeting the needs of this special group of kids. If we don't speak for them, who will? I'd like to thank you again for joining my presentation. I hope that you found some things that will be useful to you in your school districts. Please, if you have any questions, you can join me on the live question and answer session, or if you would like, you can shoot me an email, renegar@muschools.com. You can also follow me on Twitter at Becky Renegar. Please take a look at the resources attached to this session, and you'll be able to explore some of my other links and Wakelet resources connected to this presentation. Thanks again.